Hi there, my name is Thang, and I'm the lead maintainer of NextAuth.js. It's a fully open source library that makes it super easy for developers to add authentication to their application. At NextAuth.js, we strive to give you a strong security default as well as the flexibility to build your own authentication flow. You could choose between JWT or database for session strategy. You could bring your own database to store the user data using the adapters. We have adapters for many popular databases out there, including Supabase. We also have built-in integration with many OAuth providers, and we also promote passwordless authentication using the email provider. Some history about NextAuth.js. Ian Collins, the original author, open sourced the project back in 2018. After that, it gained a lot of user over the version, especially on V3 and V4 as we add more database and adapters. Bolas Orban actively worked in this period as the lead maintainer. Together with Nico Domino and Luis Augusti, they formed a core team to maintain the project with the help of many other contributors. For me, I first worked on NextAuth.js in late 2021. At first, I worked on minor issues. Later on, as I gained more knowledge about the library, I had with trying issues, fixing bugs, making DX improvements like library grading or analyzing security reports, all sort of stuff. If you want to contribute to NextAuth.js, head over to GitHub to participate in discussion, issues, and sending pull requests. You could also disclose a security vulnerability to us privately. For a deep dive into the source code, you could also check out the recent To The Source article that we published. NextAuth.js is still in development, and we have many exciting things to announce soon, so stay tuned.
NextAuth is an open source authentication server built for Next.js. It allows you to bring your own database and therefore own your own data. And recently, the open source community has built a Supabase Adapter to make it easy to use NextAuth with Supabase and storing your user data in Supabase Database. Now, one thing to point out, this is developed by the open source community and is not officially maintained by the Supabase team. So if you're looking for an officially maintained authentication server with additional features like built-in email server, phone authentication, and multi-factor authentication, we recommend that you use Supabase Auth with the auth helpers for Next.js. But if you're very much happy with the features that NextAuth provides, then you can use the Supabase Adapter here to store your user data in your Supabase database. And that's exactly what we want to look at here in this example. And the great thing is this also works with row-level security policies. So we'll look at how this works as well. So first off, let's get started with the example code. So the easiest way they recommend to get started is with this NextAuth example app. So let's go ahead and clone this one here. So now we're cloning the NextAuth example and we're installing all the dependencies. And in the next step, we will need to configure our local environment. So once the installation has completed, there we are, we can do that. And so now let's open this up in VS Code and have a look in here. So we have our .env.local, and so here is where we will need to set up all the different services, keys. So for example, if we're using GitHub, OAuth, or Google OAuth, so you wouldn't follow the Supabase docs for this here, but rather you would follow the documentation for configuring the different providers here in NextAuth. Now we need a database to persist user accounts, and but we can actually get started without this and just with pure JSON Web Tokens. So let's go ahead and run this in development mode, and we'll have a look at what the demo looks like. So this is the demo. I configured some credentials for Google sign in, and so now you can see here I'm signed in. So this is not persisted in any database, and so this will be the next step to make that happen. And so in order to do this, the first step, we can follow along the docs here in NextAuth. So we already have NextAuth installed, so I think, but we can just copy this and go ahead and install all the different things we need. So we need Supabase JS, and then the NextAuth Supabase Adapter. So we can look at the changes in our package JSON. So we have the Supabase Adapter, and we have Supabase JS. We have the dependencies installed. So we'll need to set up the Supabase Adapter in our NextAuth API route. So let's go ahead and do that. So in Pages, API, Auth, we have our NextAuth route. And so here we can then import our Supabase Adapter. Let's do that here. And then in here are all the providers. Here's the callbacks. And so what we'll need is to provide an adapter, Supabase Adapter. So we can put that in here. And so the next public Supabase URL, next public service role key. So we need to set these up in our .env.local file. So we'll need the Supabase URL and our Supabase service role key. Now, the important thing is the Supabase service role key is not allowed to be exposed publicly, so don't put a next public in front of it. And so we can find these on our Supabase dashboard. So here we have our project URL. So we can put that in here. And then we have, in order to get our service role key, we can go to the settings API, and then we will need to reveal our key and copy it over. And again, make sure that you don't reveal this to anyone. This is a secret service role key. Great, let's give that a save. The important thing is we'll need to have these defined. So what we could do is, you know, if we're running them, for example, in locally, we can run the Supabase stack locally with the Supabase CLI. We could actually put the local parameters in there to test it on kind of our local instance. But let's do this for now. Our adapter setup. Now, the important thing is we need to create the NextAuth schema in Supabase. So all the user accounts, the sessions for NextAuth will be stored in a separate schema. And we can actually set this up in our dashboard. So in the SQL editor, there is, if you scroll down to the Quickstart section, there's a NextAuth schema set up. So you can select this and it will pre-populate the schema that is needed for NextAuth. So one thing that is interesting to look at here is the function. This function here. So this is what makes the row level security policies work. So it takes out the sub, so basically the user ID from the JWT, and then it checks that against the database. So this is kind of how the row level security sort of works under the hood. And so we're just setting up a NextAuth UID here. Okay, so let's just run this. And so what we can see now is when we go to our table editor, we have a new schema here called NextAuth. And we can see we have all the tables set up that are needed for NextAuth. So lastly, one thing that is important, we need to make the NextAuth schema available via the API. So we will need to head to the API settings in our dashboard. So project settings, API, and we can see here the exposed schemas, and we'll just need to put the NextAuth schema in here and then successfully saved. So now the NextAuth schema is accessible via the API, and so our project can communicate with it. And I believe this is the first step. So if we don't need RLS, we can stop here, and we have NextAuth able to talk to the database. So let's go ahead and run our development process again and go back to our localhost app. And so now when we're signing in, for example, we're signing in with Google, we're now signed in. And if we go back to our database and our NextAuth schema and in users, we can now see that I am saved here as a user. And we can also see that there is a session. So I'm currently logged in. And my accounts here, we can see the Google Auth account is connected. So that is great. So this is all working. Our user accounts are now correctly set up. So in the next step, if we want to use row level security policies, we need to generate an access token that we can then use with communicating with the Supabase API and database. So we'll need to install a JSON web token library to sign our JWT. So let's do that. And then while that is installing, we can look at what we need here. So we basically need the callback to create the Supabase access token and append it to the session object. So what we can do is here in the callbacks, we just need this. Let's just copy this section here. And we can look at, I think we already have here. So this, in this case, is appending a user role admin. We don't want that. So what we want is we want to extend the session with the Supabase access token. And we will need to import JWT from JSON web token. So we can do that up here. And then we'll also need to install the types for JSON web token. And so now we should be fine. Yes, great. So now what we're doing is we need the Supabase JWT secret to sign our token. So that's what then is used for signing the JWT, and so we can make sure we have all that set up. So in the project settings, we go to API, and here we go copy our JWT secret, save that, and we can now use it to sign our JWT. And then lastly, we get a TypeScript error here. Supabase access token does not exist on type session. So the way we can fix that, it's also in the documentation on usage with TypeScript. So we will need to extend the types in NextAuth. Let's see if we already have the types here. I don't think so. So we'll need to create a new file, types NextAuth, this one here, and we can just copy this part where we extend the session to say that we have an optional Supabase access token. And when we give that a save, now it's fine, and we can define our Supabase access token. There we are, and that should be it to generate our access token. So now if we rerun the example, and we're logged in, let's use the API example here. So we can see we can get the session, and on the session we have the Supabase access token. And so now the way we would use that in our project is we need to inject the Supabase access token into our client creation, Supabase client creation. If we go to the me page, we can see my information here. We get the Supabase access token attached as well. So maybe if we go to me, and then we have the data in here, and what we can do is now maybe we can fetch our user data from the database. Let's do the following. We can create a public users table, and we can create a trigger to automatically copy a user when a user is signed up from the NextAuth schema over to our public schema. So let's go ahead and do that. And we want in the SQL editor, let's create a new query. And so we're creating this in our public schema now. Here, users. And so this, we have an automatic trigger. Anytime a new user signs up, they are added in there. So what I need to do now is actually delete myself from the NextAuth users. So I can just go in here and delete. And so what we can do now, also delete my accounts. Yeah, so they are cascading deletes already. And so now if I go ahead and sign in again, so now you can see I'm signed in. We have a Supabase access token. And so now if we go, we can see here where our users, if we go to our public schema users, we can also see that I've been added into the public schema. And we have active row level security policies. So we can look at this policy here. So only the authenticated user, if that's the one making the request, they can retrieve that data. And so let's actually try and retrieve that data in there. So what we'll need is we'll need our Supabase client, and we'll need the Supabase access token from the session. And then we can select our data. So let's do that. So data is our session. So we'll just get the Supabase access token. Let's use data as session. And then we'll need to import our create client from Supabase JS. And we have our public Supabase URL and that as well. And so now we are, so we are, because we're in React, we should use, we'll get our data, set data, and we'll use state from React. We'll just say this is super data, and what we can do is we can say Supabase from, and then we can use then instead of awaiting the promise, and we can then get the data in here, and we can just say set data to data, and this is yeah, so we'll just do this as any for now, null initially, and so now we're fetching the data from our users, and when we have the data, we're setting the data. So we're going to me, we can say now, see, this is the data fetched from the Supabase API. So that's it. So this is how you can make NextAuth work on Supabase to store your data to your Supabase database, your user data, your account data, your session data, as well as utilize row-level security policies with NextAuth. Thanks for tuning in, and let us know what you'd like to learn about next time. Bye-bye.